there's a lot of authors with very popular books promoting keto and paleo diets. They're very emphatic, they're very confident, they have lots of views on YouTube. And no matter how many whole food plant-based speakers or books come out, they still come out with more and more books on low carb diets and more about this. So the question is, where do you stand with people eating diets that are keto or paleo? And then also, if you do eat a whole food plant-based diet, what is your position on seeds, nuts, avocados, and olives? In other words, is it a problem if you have lots and lots of that in your diet? Seeds, raw nuts, avocados, and olives. And then even if you can have the seeds and nuts, are the saturated fat nuts, such as macadamia nuts, Brazil nuts, cashews, that have higher saturated fat, more of a concern? If you could comment on that.
Cede to Dr. Katz.
Okay, so you lumped many things together, Steve. Let's line them up and knock them down. So the first thing to address is low carb. And in some ways, it's fundamentally silly because all plant foods are carbohydrate. And the idea that we should avoid all plant foods, to me, is an outrageous concept at odds with the vast preponderance of scientific evidence. So people conflate carbohydrate with refined carbohydrate, added sugar, white flour. And yeah, we would all be better off limiting our intake of added sugar and white flour. So some carbohydrates are not so terrific, and avoiding them is perfectly fine. The idea that we should curtail intake of all carbohydrates is basically like saying that jelly beans and pinto beans or lentils and lollipops are the same, because they're all carbohydrate sources, but really quite absurd to suggest that these have comparable health effects. So I'm opposed to using macronutrient thresholds to talk about diet quality. They really miss the point. But that said, you actually can have a low, if you will, bad carbohydrate plant-based diet. And the leader in that space is Dr. David Jenkins at the University of Toronto, inventor of the glycemic index, by the way. Many years ago, he was concerned with the popularity of the Atkins diet and thought, well, if that's where people are going, to a low-carb diet, can we have our low-carb plants and eat them too? In other words, can I develop a high-quality, plant-based, low-carbohydrate diet where I use an operational definition of poor-quality carbohydrate? And the answer was yes. He called that the Eco-Atkins diet because it had ecological benefits as well as human health benefits. So you can check that out. Dr. David Jenkins, University of Toronto, Eco-Atkins diet. So it's possible to have a plant-based low-carbohydrate diet if you use the appropriate definition of low carbohydrate. You mentioned keto. I'm not a fan. It's a highly restrictive diet. Few people can sustain it over time. We have no evidence that it's compatible with long-term health. There are some medical uses. A ketogenic diet, a truly ketogenic diet with extreme restriction of carbohydrate intake, can be effective in ameliorating intractable seizures. And the reason it does that is it quiets electrical activity in the brain. Now, I don't think a healthy person who's not having intractable epilepsy wants the electrical brain activity dampened, but the ketogenic diet appears to do that. I'm not a fan. Most versions of the ketogenic diet rely on a lot of animal foods. That's bad for the animals, bad for the planet, and bad for the people consuming the diet. And again, it's so restrictive, most people can't maintain it. You also threw paleo in the mix, Steve, and the simple reality is we all had ancestors in the Stone Age, so we all come from ancestors who went through a phase, human existence, where the paleo diet was the only diet. It was the Paleolithic era. Everybody ate that way. There's a lot of debate about exactly what the paleo diet was, and for the most part, an agreement that there were probably many variants on the theme of the paleo diet. Some paleoanthropologists suggest that even then our diets were overwhelmingly plant-based, but most of them agree there were some animal foods. But the animal foods our Paleolithic ancestors ate were dramatically different from what people waving a paleo banner today are eating. There was no Paleolithic pepperoni. There was no Paleolithic bacon, right? So people ate meat in the Paleolithic. They were eating wild animals that they hunted, and those animals were lean. They were actually relatively rich in omega-3 fat in their flesh. They were low in saturated fat. So paleo is something we may want to unpack further. I think the answer there is it depends. If you ate mostly wild plants and hunted wild animals with a bow and arrow and ate those as a small part of your diet. Do we have any evidence that that's harmful to people? We actually don't. Now, again, we don't have studies comparing an optimized paleo diet to an optimized vegan diet to say what the outcomes would be. But I'm not sure it's really relevant because 8 billion hungry Homo sapiens can't be foragers. We don't have enough space on the planet, right? We can't all be hunting. So I actually did the math for a column I wrote once, and for 8 billion people to be hunter-gatherers, we would need 15 times the surface area of the earth. So from my point of view, it's a moot question, right? Maybe the paleo diet was very good in the Stone Age, but Dorothy, we're not there anymore. And finally, when it comes to nuts, seeds, olives, avocado, I'm fine. I think they're perfectly good. I'm trying to give brief answers, but we have, for example, the work of Dean Ornish, which just showed us that you can regress coronary atherosclerosis and prevent recurrent events with a very low-fat plant-based diet in people at high cardiac risk. But we actually have much the same evidence, the same prevention of recurrent cardiac events from the Lyon Diet Heart Study, which used a high-fat Mediterranean diet, but it was good fats. So it was the very sources you're talking about: nuts, seeds, extra virgin olive oil, olives, avocado, probably a bit of fish and seafood in the mix too. So I don't think we need to restrict total fat to have an optimal heart healthy diet. I think we do need to consume the right kinds of fat. And then lastly, you raised the issue of what about the saturated fat in the nuts, and in particular certain nuts like hazelnuts. The answer is it depends. There's nothing intrinsically bad or evil, if you will, about saturated fat. In fact, we need some. It's all about proportionality and total quantities. The modern diet is terribly unbalanced. We get excesses of saturated fat, excesses of omega-6 fat, insufficiencies of monounsaturated, certain polyunsaturates, omega-3. Anything that moves us in the direction of a healthy balance is generally tolerated very well. Anything that moves us away from balance is bad. So if the only source of saturated fat in your diet, or the primary source, is nuts and seeds, it's very unlikely you're going to consume too much. The problem for most people is they're getting lots of saturated fat from meat and dairy, and then the hazelnuts are adding insult to injury, right? So then you want to be concerned about extra saturated fat from any source. But in the context of an otherwise optimal plant-based diet, I wouldn't be terribly concerned about the saturated fat nuts. I think I covered everything you queued up, if not close.
Thank
Nothing to add.
Okay, and what about if I also threw in coconut products into that?
I'll comment on that. You know, the research is relatively limited. There are very tiny little areas that coconut is a major portion of their diet. Everybody brings up this tribe called the Kitavans. I think it's 1,200 people in the world. Not a lot of basis to make worldwide recommendations. But, you know, we know that the saturated fat content of coconuts and palm oil is the highest, you know, of anything recorded, 85, 90%. There are some studies that coconut oil disrupts our gut lining and allows bacterial products called endotoxins into our bloodstream more than almost any other oil out there. These are animal studies, but they're not what you'd want to reproduce for your own gut. So I generally tell people you've got so many wonderful oils, and I predominantly focus on extra virgin olive oil. There's just no reason to add an unknown with a bad reputation of coconut oil in the diet. You know, you're in Jamaica once a year and you have a coconut and you drink the water. I think you should enjoy.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, the principal saturated fat in coconut oil is lauric acid, short chain saturated fatty acid. There is some research to suggest, and by the way, that's an important concept in its own right. Saturated fat is a family of molecules, and they don't all behave the same. So there's saturated fat in dark chocolate, stearic acid, which does not appear to be atherogenic or pro-inflammatory. The prevailing saturated fats in meat and dairy, myristic and palmitic acid, clearly are. Lauric acid, the jury's out, but I would agree with Joel. There was never any evidence to support the very hyped health claims for coconut oil. So the best we can say is, maybe it's not as bad as the very high saturated fat content would suggest it might be. We have no real evidence of health benefit. I think about the best we could say is maybe because it's principally lauric acid, it might be relatively neutral in terms of direct inflammatory effects. But then again, there are these indirect effects mediated by the microbiome that also have to be factored in. So I would say occasional use is fine because it has desirable culinary properties, or it's part of something you want to eat, or it's something you want to do on a vacation. But I would not turn to coconut oil seeking health benefit.